So I want to really just deal with a couple of things before I finish in terms of, are we providing the research and the capacity building that's social, economic, as well as biophysical to farmers to adequately adapt in the future? And are these different from a business as usual scenario that could be picked up in a productivity agenda? Let's just take two examples in the time available. One is elevated CO2. It's the certainty, if there's uncertainty in climate change, the certainty is elevated CO2. Over 390 now, charging on towards 450. There are experiments, one major one in Australia, several internationally, about looking, is there any variation in the response of plants to high CO2? And this is the Horsham, what's known as ag FACE, and FACE is called a free air CO2 enrichment facility. And basically what it tries to do is look at the growth of plants, and in this case, different genotypes of wheat, at a future CO2 concentration, in this case 550 parts per million, something like 240, 250, to know whether we're selecting genotypes that will go into the treadmill of developing and the conveyor belt of developing new wheat varieties that actually are responsive to those levels of CO2 or not as responsive. And there's quite a bit of genetic variation in that. And I just showed you these are commonly used wheat varieties at present. And on the right, you'll see is the response to this 550 over ambient CO2. And you can see that the variation in that response goes from something like nothing or zero in Hartog right up to more than 50%. So these are preliminary data, but they give indications that there's a great degree of variability there, which Scott Chapman in CSIRO is also working with to see whether they can identify traits that will be useful in new wheat varieties of the future to take advantage of that CO2 level, which we know we're going to get. The second example is some of our own work with my colleague Leanne Webb and CSIRO colleagues as well, is we've been looking at what has happened in the Australian wine industry over the last 25 years. This is just one example, Mornington Peninsula Vineyard, Main Ridge. Vintage has moved forward to an earlier date, about 8 days a decade. In fact, in that 25 years, something like 20 days. That's quite common. It has, in some areas, good because they have difficulty in ripening grapes. In many areas, it's not good because you ripen in a warmer, hotter month, and there are real questions about the quality of your grape to make quality wine. So, how could we adapt to that? We worked with 40 vineyards around Australia with long-term data sets, some as much as 40 years or 60 years. And in that, we've recently showed and published last week that it's not just all the temperature effect on the vine. We're able to, if you like, apportion the move forward, that 8 days a decade, into what was due to the straight effect of temperature on the vine. Not much we can do about because grapevine genetics doesn't change much. But a third of it was effectively due to deep soil moisture, something that you can do something about. And a third of it was due to crop yield. As people had moved towards higher quality wines, you decrease the crop yield to supposedly get better quality, and that sometimes hastens vintage. So those last two characteristics, soil moisture and grape yield, are something that are actually in your hands as a management. So in terms of developing adaptation strategies, this is one way, just an example of how research can point to what you might begin to do in developing adaptation strategies. So really in conclusion, then, there's clearly a specific climate change adaptation research agenda, in my view. This research agenda needs to be strongly integrated with ongoing productivity research. Secondly, it also needs to be integrated with this emerging area of carbon farming to ensure that some of the activities under the Carbon Farming Initiative don't have perverse outcomes in terms of adaptation of the agricultural system and vice versa. And I might say in that I've just dealt with some technological advances in CO2 and grapevines, but there's an enormous part in there, as Kim has mentioned, in modelling, and actually Fleur is going to mention in terms of the social aspects. And then the question is, who should fund this research and how best is it organised? And this is where I want to finish. We tend to like to use a climate change adaptation framework. This is something that Mark Howden first proposed, and we've all played around with it a bit. And it sort of has three levels of really adaptive management at small changes in climate. Larger changes in climates, there's sort of systems adapting, and then if you get to more extreme changes in climates, you can get more transformational changes. And that would mean that you may have to move, or you could change your enterprises within where you are, as people are doing. The question is, when you get to those higher levels of adaptation, they often bounce between industries, and most of our agricultural research in Australia is organised in industry silos. So who funds research to help you move from grains to sheep? Should it be sheep or should it be grains? So that is a question. So what we think is that when you look at this adaptation research agenda and who should fund it, it should be co-funding. But we think as you get further up the chain in adaptation, you probably need to have a greater input of research funds and resources from government, because this is something that is of a greater societal good and a greater public good than just a straight private good within an industry on a farm. So thank you, Andrew.